You've set down your place in the world, and maybe it won't live, for 5 centuries, but at least you've done it, and it will live for some time. Don't count anybody as dead until you've taken their pulse. As long as you have tenacity, you have a good story, you have good anecdotes, and then you have a good chance of getting published. The first thing I want to say is people wonder, about writing an irresistible memoir, not just one that's a chronology. What's required? Red Smith, who was one of the great sports writers of the 20th century, said, there really isn't anything to writing. You sit down and you open a vein. And that's about it. All it takes is blood and guts. So if you're willing to really be honest and open and venture out, I can tell you everybody has a good story. And also, nobody's gotten away easy. Maybe things were wonderful when they were young, and then things happen. And in many ways, the people who've had the roughest time are the luckiest ones because they've learned skills along the way. Okay, what is the value of writing a memoir? That's a thing that people wonder about, because we live in such an age of information overload. So why do it? Well, there are a number of reasons you should really consider doing your memoir. It's a great thing for your family. I would tell my children a lot of stories when they were little, and they'd say, "Oh, Mom." But, it's really interesting that now that they're in their 20s, they're coming back to me and saying, "Remember that story you told me? What about that time when you took off your bathing suit and walked home naked?" And it's true. Also, that brings up another point. As I said, I'm going to range around that you always look for signal traits in somebody. And what was their position in the family? And I was, hands down, the family rascal. So what happened was, I was also, as the youngest of 4 girls, the recipient of hand-me-down clothes. I think my first words were store-bought. So my sister Joyce, who's 15 months older than I am, got a new bathing suit, and she was 8.5, and I thought, I'd better try it out. So I tried it out, and I was walking down the sidewalk to the sprinkler down the street, and there were boys playing ball in the street, and my sister spotted me, and she said, "Lynn Haney, you take off that bathing suit right now." So I said, "Okay," handed it to her, and walked home. For me, the way I'm starting my memoir, which is sneaking into the movies, is what happened to me as a senior in college. And as I look back on my life, I am really, on the one hand, grateful that I have been very lucky. And I've been part of a generation that, for the most part, was very lucky, except for the boys going off to Vietnam. There haven't been a lot of tragedies in our lives. I realized that my story was a much more updated version of Our Hearts Are Young and Gay. That's a very old memoir about 2 women who go off to Paris. And I was part of a cohort of women who graduated from college in 1963. And we were just at the beginning of the women's rights movement, of the civil rights movement, of the whole 60s. Many women of that time chose marriage, and I was so interested in, I was listening to 2 husbands talking about how bright their wives were, and they went to Catherine Gibbs and they took secretarial courses. And I thought, gee, that's an alternate lifestyle. And then, and then there were always the women in college that I knew who went on to medical school and law school, and they were the pioneers. They were ahead of their time. And men would make derogatory comments about how tough they were, et cetera, et cetera. I was part of a different cohort, which we were the English majors and the art majors. And we, read all the romantic books, and we thought that that's what we wanted. So as a senior in college, I had these vague ideas that I would go off and have a wonderful time in Europe and start my career as a writer, and then I would marry a diplomat. And he would be off tending his country, and he wouldn't get in my hair a lot. But he would send checks, and we would have great parties. And so with that mindset, I got a call from one of my best friends in college, and she said, Lynn, we have to meet at the Tuck Shop, which was the student coffee shop. This is serious. So I said, okay, and I went to the summit meeting, and she said, do you realize what's going to happen to us? And I said, no. And she said, we're seniors. If we don't get married, we'll have to face life. I said, I'm not going to face life. I'm going to Paris. And every day, the internet is getting better in terms of resources. I was thinking about my mother, who graduated from Carnegie Mellon, then Carnegie Tech, in 1933. And in the poster, there's the picture of the 4 girls. That's my mother with the big hat on. And she had been the campus queen, and it seemed like she could have gone. The headline of this article was, will Kay Woolley go to Hollywood? Now, the thing that's interesting is I was sitting in the Guilford Library and I typed in Kay Woolley, Carnegie Tech, 1933. Up pops this article, just like that, And here I am reading about my mother as a senior in college. And what struck me was she was so young. In every family, there are secrets. So often, you won't hear about the secret until it's somewhere along the line. And the idea is not to be judgmental, because these people have been harboring these secrets for a long time. So suppose you have an Auntie Monique, and she lived in Provence for many years. And after you talk to her, you think that she's going to tell you about her secret sauce, and how wonderful it was, and all those family dinners. And then she says, I have a flair for cannibalism. You say, oh. And you're thinking, was her boeuf bourguignon, Homo sapien bourguignon? So what do you do when you really have some fascinating family stories, but there have been a lot of really bad things, a lot of heavy drinking, maybe some abuse, some royal scenes, etc. I think it's a good idea to change the names of the people involved. Now, the thing is, or you can kill them, or they can die a natural death. You're going to tell about your Uncle Ralph with his wandering fingers and how much havoc that caused in the family, or how your histrionic grandmother would throw plates at Thanksgiving dinner. And then you have to tell stories on yourself. And this is what I have found that I've had to do with my memoir. When I was working in New York at CBS, and I was concerned because it was 3 days before the taxes were due, and my boss said, Ned Schnurman, who was the head of local news, Lynn, you've got to go down to the Lower East Side and see Harold Rothman. He's the poor man's lawyer. And he said, he does all the cops on the Lower East Side. You won't be audited. I said, he's my man. And the way it worked was that he had a storefront operation. He took the tired, the poor, the hungry masses yearning to breathe free, And all these sweet young things from places like Time Magazine and CBS News. And so you had this ethnic mix, shall we say, you know, of a lot of new arrivals to the country mixed in with girls in their Gucci Poochies, and you lined up on chairs and you moved up while he, you know, would do one person's taxes and another person's. Well, this took forever. And I was sitting there and I thought, I just want this over with. Well, I finally got to the chair next to Harold, and this man ran in, and he said, I just shot my wife. And I stood up and said, it's my turn. And, you know, that brings back the part of my core personality, which is, as the youngest of 4 girls, I always felt I wasn't getting my share, I was going to be left out, etc. You know, so I have to assert myself, or I have to outsmart other people. And so once again, you think of those stories that illuminate who you were. When I was about 10 years old, a teacher wrote a note home and said, Lynn has writing talent, I think you should encourage it. Mother read the note. She was sitting across from me at the breakfast table, and she said, promise me now, you will never, ever write about me. That's quite a burden to put on a child. And I was talking about this to my son, Alexander, and I said, you know, it's a conundrum because I'm trying to write my memoirs, and here my mother said this. And Alexander said, you know, Mom, you use Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a software program where you talk into the computer and it types. He said, you're not writing your memoirs, you're telling your memoirs. So he got me off the hook. We walk around with these movies of what we think we were to somebody, you know, your first love, etc. And then you find out they're on a different movie. A friend of my sister's was someone who had a checkered romantic career with some great ones and some not so great. You know, with major romances and minor romances and fillers. So a filler called her up out of the blue. And this woman is in her 60s, and he called up to say that he had had a stroke and his memory wasn't very good. And she said, you know, trying to even remember his name, oh, I'm very sorry. He said, but one thing I do remember, you were the best lay I ever had. She didn't remember it that way. Some of the best memoirs have been memoirs that people have written as an effort to deal with a trauma or to, you know, it's their coping device. And a classic example is Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. I think a lot of people have read that one, that she was married to John Gregory Dunn. They not only were husband and wife for 40 years, but they had offices adjoining each other in their apartment, and they talked back and forth all day. And she was preparing dinner one night, and he was sitting in a wingback chair, and his hand was up with a drink, and it just stopped, you know, and she thought he was playing a joke. And then she realized, you know, that he died almost immediately after there. Her way of coping was to just take notes on the whole process. And people could say, well, that was pretty cold-blooded, you know, he's dropped, I got a story. But it was her way of doing what she had always done, the way she processed all her feelings. And if you've had a traumatic event in your life, this is a very good idea, which also that if you have a black sheep in your family, Bernard Shaw said, bring them out and make them dance. You know, don't be ashamed of those people. So I leave you with that thought, you know, mind your history, write it down, don't be inhibited, just get to it.